Okay, let's get started with Chapter 4, Money and Inflation, lecture number 3. And in this lecture, what we want to do is we want to take this quantity theory that we just developed and let's confront it with the data. So in other words, what I want to do is, with any theory, we have a model, and this model, this theory or model, explains or tries to explain how something works about the real world, how something about the real world works. Well, that theory or model should then have predictions. All right, so if we give it a certain set of data, then we should expect to see the actual world behave in a way similar to what the model says it should. So to get started, let's take a look and see, well, what does the quantity theory imply? What predictions can we get about how the real world should behave from the quantity theory? And really, we get two major ones. Number one, countries with higher money growth rates should have higher inflation rates. Number two, the long-run trend behavior of a country's inflation should be similar to the long-run trend behavior of a country's money growth rate. So here's the question. Do these implications come true? Is the data consistent with what the quantity theory says we should expect? So let's start out with number one. Number one, we're going to look at over a cross-section of time. So we're going to take at one point in time a whole bunch of countries. And what we want to do here is we've plotted on the vertical axis, all right, we've plotted the inflation rate. And on the horizontal axis, we've plotted the money growth rate. And we can see, by and large, we have a fairly strong positive relationship in this data. If we were to try to draw something like a best fit line through this data, it looks something like this. Right, something like that. And we can see it definitely slopes upwards. And we can see there is this general tendency that as the money growth rate increases, inflation rate also increases. So now let's take a look at the second implication that we get from the quantity theory. And that is, essentially, the money growth rate and the inflation rate should move together. Well, the first thing that we see in this graph, and what we have on here is plotted the money growth rate and the inflation rate. And this is the official measure M2 money growth rate, as well as inflation. And we see they almost move opposite of one another. Okay, they almost move in opposite directions. It looks like the correlation's negative, which is exactly the opposite of what we would expect. And there could be some explanations for that. First explanation could be, well, what's causing what? Is the growth rate of money causing the inflation rate to change, or is the inflation rate causing the growth rate of money to change? Now, what do I mean by that? Well, during most of this period, the Federal Reserve is very much interested in inflation, particularly from approximately 1982 on. All right. One of the things that the Federal Reserve is targeting is the inflation rate. They want to keep that low. Well, if the inflation rate goes up, what does the Federal Reserve want to do? Reduce the money supply, so lower the growth rate of money. And if the inflation rate goes down, what do they want to do? They may increase the growth rate of money. So there could be some what we call reverse causation going on, which is always the problem in doing empirical macroeconomics work, because we can't just hold variables constant and do experiments. We're watching actual nature. They're observational studies, and so we always have lots of different variables changing all at once. However, if we take a step back and look at not just the short-run fluctuations, but if we look at the overall trend, we see this overall trend that they are very, very much in sync with one another. That definitely these long-run trends move together, which is as the quantity theory predicts. So I wanted to take a step back and show you a little bit of research that I've worked on. And one of those things that we would expect to see in the quantity theory is a response from price level with a shock to monetary policy. So if we can track the money supply, okay, we should see a decrease in price level. Or if, as is depicted in this in these graphs, we see an expansion in the money supply, we should see an increase in price level. And if you look at these impulse responses, and that's what they're called, and we're not going to get too carried away with all the technical stuff behind this, but the dark line shows, well, how that variable, how this model predicts that variable will change when we have a positive monetary policy shock. So expansionary monetary policy, or an increase in the money supply. You can think of it that way. And we see definitely when we look here at the response of the price level, right, we see a positive response in price. So the price level goes up when we have a positive shock to the money supply. So money supply goes up. All right, well, that is consistent with what the quantity theory suggests. Take one more. This comes from another research paper that I'm currently working on. And in here we want to say, well, the quantity theory should say we're not going to explain very much about real GDP. And we're certainly, if we do explain a little bit about real GDP with changes in the supply of money, so the supply of money should really not affect real GDP that much, but it should affect price quite a lot. Well, on that front, this paper is holding that a little bit in question, because we see in this paper what I've plotted here is something called a variance decomposition. In other words, it's how much of real GDP or price level is fluctuating. How much of that fluctuation can be explained by an increase in our money supply. And so what we've done in this model is we've simulated an increase in the money supply. And here we see that, well, it explains as much as 15, 20, and 19% of that variation in real GDP or real output being due to our policy shock according to this model. This is our estimate according to the model that we're using in this particular paper. And likewise, not a lot, very small amounts. For as much as 4 years, as much as 2 years later, okay, so 4 quarters ahead is 1 year later, 8 quarters ahead is 2 years later. As much as 2 years later, only seeing less than 1% of the variation in price level due to this monetary policy shock. Well, that's not so good for our quantity theory. But by the time we get to 20 periods ahead, all right, that's 4 years out, we see 20% of that variation is being explained by our original increase in the money supply. So here's the takeaway on this. This is very similar result that we saw in this plot. When we look at the short run fluctuations, so this is just the year-over-year growth rates, we see, well, the relationship is a little wibbly wobbly, right? But when we look in these long run trends, what do we see? The long run trends in money growth and inflation do tend to move together, just as the quantity theory predicts. So these results that I've gotten with this paper that I'm currently working on are not too far out of sync with what we would expect. And that is just a little bit of confronting the quantity theory with data.